Good evening, everybody. Welcome to Model Railroading Live, the number one model railroading show in the entire world. Today is October 10th, 2020, and we're continuing in our series of small layout, big opportunities. And tonight's show is part three. We did last week 2.2, the week before, and 2.1. And now we're doing part three. And this one is going to be on operations and how to operate on a small layout. I'm guessing Tommy K, as I actually call him, Johnny 2618, and Alex B, Alley Boy, as I affectionately call him. And I will give you over to them now on this operations on a small layouts with big opportunities. It's all yours, Tom.
All right, thanks, Bill. I appreciate it. Yeah, we're going to talk tonight about operations, but it may not be exactly what you're thinking. When you mention operations, a lot of times people kind of roll their eyes and it's like, oh, well, I just want to run trains. I just want to enjoy the layout. And we're not going to tell you how to operate, but we're going to give you hopefully some helpful tips and some things to think about when you're operating your layout. One of the things that you need to consider is when you're designing your layout, how do you want to operate it? That all ties back into the design side of it. What you need to do is try to envision what the trains would be doing. If you're designing a switching layout, which primarily a small layout is going to be a switching layout, try to envision how the trains would operate and how the local jobs would get done. And that will help you a long way to designing a layout that works. If you just kind of assemble some track and throw some buildings out there and then you realize, oh, it doesn't really work because I can't get to this end and I've got to go back and forth, and it just doesn't make sense. So what you really want to do is look to the prototype for inspiration. Try to see how the prototype designs their track, how do they get switches and serve industries. And what you'll find is a lot of times it's very simple. The railroad doesn't want to waste money by doing complex track arrangements and double switchbacks and all that other stuff. I mean, they'll do it if they have to, but they really don't want to. They really want to keep it as inexpensive as possible. So what we're going to talk about tonight also is some prototype procedures that can be incorporated into your operating session. And why would you want to do that? Why do you want to incorporate some prototype procedures? Well, if you've watched the prototype, you see it takes a long time for them to do any switching moves or just to do anything. Why? Because there's steps and procedures, safety primarily, that they have to follow the rules so that they don't get hurt, injured, or mess something up. One of the first ones that probably one of the most important ones is brake tests. On a prototype, they're going to need to do a brake test prior to departing the yard. They want to make sure that they have air pressure all the way through the train, all the way to the last car. They'll typically put a gauge on the end, and then they'll walk the train and they'll walk the brakes on, and then they'll walk the brakes off. And that takes a lot of time. And that's something that you can do on your layout when you're making up your train in the yard, is just spend a few extra minutes kind of mentally, we'll say, walking the train. So you're going to go through and just kind of make sure each car is on the track, that everything's connected up, and that way there you don't have any surprises when the dispatcher or whenever you say, all right, I'm ready to leave the yard. You also want to double check your switch list and make sure you have the correct cars in your train and they're organized properly. One of the next things that the prototype does is they do safety stops. Depending on the railroad, not all railroads, but most of the railroads nowadays, you're going to have to do a safety stop prior to coupling to a car. Why do they want to do that? Well, they want the engine to be under control when it makes its coupling. Typically, railroads have rules that the coupling is not supposed to be more than 3 miles an hour. So to keep that engine under control, they're going to stop the locomotive approximately 1 car length away from the car that they're going to couple up to. Then the conductor is going to get out and he's going to do a car inspection. He's going to walk around the car, make sure that the car is in good condition, make sure it's actually on the rails, and make sure there's no equipment hanging off or anything that's damaged. And why do they want to do that? Well, like most things, if you think about when you rent a car, when you return that car, if there's damage on that car, they're going to say that you did it if you didn't identify it in the inspection. Well, the same thing on the railroad. If you connect to that car, you've bought that car. And now the crew's going to have to explain why something is broken after they've connected to it. So they want to inspect the car, and they can actually reject a car, which would be an interesting thing to do on your layout. Is every once in a while for your switch crew, throw in that the car is damaged or defective and they can't pick it up, or there's a problem with it and they need to take it to the repair in place or the RIP track. And that's something that I do occasionally. I'll identify a car that maybe has a bad door on a open top hopper. One of the bottom discharge doors maybe didn't close properly and it's leaking product. So the crew didn't load it at the gravel industry. So it needs to go back and have that door repaired, and they can do it at the RIP track, or they may have to do more extensive repairs at another location. So they're going to do a safety stop. They're going to do an inspection of the car. And then after they do the inspection, then they'll come forward and connect up to the car, which is something that we can easily do when we're operating our layout. Just pause, stop as you're coming in. That way you're going to couple a lot slower and more realistically. The next thing that the prototype does is they'll do what they call a 3-step or a red zone. And for those of you that don't know, what that is anytime you're going to place yourself in a fouling position, which means you're going between the cars, or if the train moves, you're going to get hurt, damaged, killed, or worse, right? You can't get worse than killed, but you don't want to have that. So anytime you place yourself in a fouling position, you have to request a red zone or 3-step procedure. And basically what that is the engineer is going to place the reverser in the idle position. They're going to apply the brakes. And the third step, if for a 3-step, they're going to shut off the field generator. Basically, what that's doing is that's locking the train down so it's not going to move. That way there, it's safe for the crew member, in this case, the conductor, to go between the cars, to couple the air hoses, maybe to shut the angle cock valve, which supplies the air hoses, or to do any other things that they need to do between the cars or on the cars. You don't want those cars moving when you're going between them, because that's a very dangerous position. Many people have been killed over the years because the train moved unexpectedly. One of the other things that we can also simulate is, yes.
I don't mean to interrupt you.
Sure.
But train, the movement of the train unintentionally is never unintentional. Someone has to do it. I have had close called experiences when I've worked on the diesel trains in transit, where we have to walk between and we apply those same rules. And my fourth rule was your eyes have always got to see me. If you don't see me on the ground, don't touch anything. In fact, I'd prefer you be on the platform of the diesel and not looking. So that's another way. I mean, that's realistic. And I know this is model railroading, and we like to romanticize about how we should do this, but it's a lot different when you're doing it at night and it's cold and it's wet and it's snowing.
Yes, exactly. Exactly.
And it's best if the guy you're working with, your partner, he likes you too.
That's true. Well, the thing is, you don't want to have to explain to your partner's significant other why something happened and they're not coming home from work because they were.
Well, exactly right. Exactly right.
Yeah, so we want to be safe on a model railroad. Usually nobody dies, so it's not as serious. But still, you want to follow some of the prototype procedures, and what that does is that slows down your operations. I'm going to do a little demonstration. I'm going to do a demonstration a little bit later on how some people operate, we'll say normally, and then following some of the prototype procedures. And one of the things I was talking to John about this, and it's not an all or nothing. This is basically a buffet. You can select the items off of this list that we're giving you tonight, or these prototype procedures that you want to incorporate on your railroad. You don't have to do all of them. You don't have to do any of them. But maybe there's some that you want to follow and some that you don't, some you don't really care. That's fine. It's all in what's up to you, what you prefer. I don't think anybody wants to sit there for 10 minutes walking the brakes on and walking them off, because that's kind of boring. But what you can do is you can verbalize that. Okay, we're doing a brake test, or we're walking the brakes, and we're going to just kind of visually look at the cars, and okay, now we're done. It doesn't take the real time. Most of the time we're looking at a fast clock anyway, so it's not gonna take a full 10 minutes. But I've done a brake test on a scenic passenger train, and it takes a while to walk 10, 80 something foot passenger cars all the way up to one end, turn around, come all the way to the back, and do the full brake test. So we already mentioned about three-step and red zone, and that's very important. So if you're working with a two-person crew, that's one of the things that the operators can do, is they can call out these procedures to each other as just, again, replicating and thinking about what a real conductor would be doing when they're going between cars. Just request red zone. And with the proto throttle, that's actually pretty neat, because you can center the reverser and apply the brake. So you are actually pretty close to following a three-step or a red zone procedure. After you've done a car inspection and you've hooked up, you're going to have to set and release the handbrakes. And most people don't realize how long it takes to set and release handbrakes unless you've done it for a living. And it does. It takes forever. You got to go to each car, crank the handbrakes down. You got to have a sufficient number of handbrakes set every time you leave those cars. You don't want them to roll away, which brings up another procedure, is a securement test, which means you're going to put a little slack in the coupler, in or out, depending on which way it is, and you're going to make sure that the car doesn't roll away. Make sure that that handbrake is actually holding. The brake may be defective. Just because you set the brake doesn't mean that it's actually going to stay. So on the prototype, they're required to do a securement test, which means they sit there for a minute, make sure that that car doesn't roll after they've applied the brake. And again, you don't have to sit there for a full minute on your layout, but just think about that. And when you set the handbrake, I'm going to show you an app here in a little bit that does a great job of simulating setting and releasing the handbrakes.
Hey, Tom.
Yes, sir.
When you're doing that, and I have a question. When you're on level ground, let's say you're on an incline or a slight incline on your layout, how many brakes would you apply on level track?
Well, actually, I'm familiar with the Georgia Northeastern, and there is a chart that tells you how many handbrakes, as a minimum, must be set on a specific siding, excuse me, or at a specific industry. So it will tell you, on this such and such a track, you need to have 50% of the handbrake set, or 100% of the handbrake set. Where we were in Blue Ridge, it was a slight hill going north, and we had to have 100% handbrake set. And we also had to do a securement test. Even after we set all the handbrakes, the engineer would do a securement test to make sure that the train wasn't moving at all. And sometimes it can move. We've had a time where we released the brakes. The engine had the brakes applied, and it was kind of wet and slippery or whatever. And we're standing outside the train, and then the train slowly starts moving, which is not a good thing when there's nobody in the engine. It was starting to slide down the hill because we had released the brakes on the passenger cars, and the engine brake was applied, but it was a little slippery, so it was starting to slide down the hill. Which, again, throw on some extra brakes and get back in the cab, and the engineer did what he had to do to. It was, fortunately, we were standing right there, and we didn't really move very far, just a couple of feet. But again, it just shows what can happen on the prototype.
Robert Holman wants to know: are these tests per the handbook regulations or real world train crew experience?
It's through in this case, the book I have is the prototype, is the Georgia Northeastern handbook. When I worked for the Blue Ridge Scenic, I got a handbook which was all the rules. There's also a general code of regulations that applies to the East Coast. There's one for the West Coast. You can find those online. You can find, if you're modeling a specific prototype, you might be able to find that handbook, the rules handbook, somewhere online or at a train show or something like that, which is always good. But you can just go through and on the internet, just do an internet search for train handling rules, and you'll see short lines and a bunch of other railroads come up, and just, you can download them and read them, see if there's something in there that you think would be good for your railroad. I'll talk a little bit more about it, but I set up, I don't know if you can see that there, but it's the Georgia Northeastern operating rules, which is a little handout that I give my operators when they show up. And it just gives the rules a kind of a very condensed version of the Georgia Northeastern prototype rules. And it gives them an idea of kind of what we want to do. There's no penalty. It's as Johnny Depp in Pirates of the Caribbean said, it's not rules, it's guidelines. Uh, there's no penalty for not following the rules, but it's a guideline. We'd like you to follow them, but nobody gets in trouble if you don't follow the rules.
And
Yes.
like Tom was saying, you can pick and choose and make it a buffet. I don't have a handbook. I've yet to get my hands on a rule book for Farm Rail, which is my prototype. But I have an old rule book that was given to me by a crew member from the Stillwater Central, which is another Oklahoma short line, and that's kind of good enough for me. I kind of look through what they do and just have. I also am a rail fan in addition to modeling, so I'll go out and just watch some of these trains work, and I'll say I could incorporate that into my layout, or that sounds like a little extra work, and I don't want to do that. And I'll be honest, there are different operating sessions where I get more. When I sit here and operate Farm Rail for an hour, I'll get really in depth on trying to make it more prototypical. Whereas I have another smaller layout, East Penn. If I throw that one on, and I just want to switch a few cars for dinner, I might not follow too many rules other than prototypical speeds and horn and bell signals, because I just want to move a few cars around, and so I can even raise or lower the level of, I don't want to say seriousness, but intensity with what I'm doing things prototypically, depending on just what mood I'm in.
Right. No, exactly. And again, when I'm doing a full-fledged operation where I have people over, I'll follow the rules. But if I'm restaging, I may go a little bit quicker just because I'm restaging. So I'm not following all the rules. I may not be doing all the same prototype procedures. I may be operating a little bit faster. One of the other things that is good to use is the horn and the use of the bell. For those that don't know, the horn is, you have certain signals. Typically 2 toots of the horn is moving forward, 3 toots of the horn is back up, and the signal for the grid crossing is 2 longs, a short, and a long, with the last long blast as you're going through the crossing. One of the things I've found operating on other layouts is if you're operating by yourself and it's a much larger layout, a lot of times people aren't using the horn signals, they're not using the bell, they're just too busy focused on operation, which we'll talk about a little bit later, using a 2-person crew. That way there, the engineer can actually concentrate on doing the things that an engineer would do, which would be using the appropriate signals as they're operating. And again, the use of the bell pretty much is any time that there's people moving around, leaving like an engine facility is a prime example for using a bell. When there's people walking around, they may not see that the engine is getting ready to move, so the bell is used to warn them. Also, as you're going through grade crossings, you need to have the bell activated along with the horn. And there's other times that the bell would be used, again, anytime that you think that it's safe or would make it more safe to let people know that the train is moving, you would start the bell ringing. As we're going through here, let me bring this up here. John, you got anything that you want to add on prototype operations?
Not on the realistic side. Once we start getting into the more relaxed part, I'll go into a little bit what I do. But as a newcomer and beginner in the hobby, I'm still learning a lot of this stuff. And although it's really interesting to me to learn all the rules, it's fun kind of applying, like you said, the buffet style of what I'd like to do, how serious I want to take it. So we'll go into a little bit more when we go into the relaxed side a little bit.
Right. Okay. What I'm going to do here is I'm going to share this. This is we're going to call it an app, but it's not really an app. It's a website. It's done by Ed Kopinski, and it's the Train Crew app. It's at http://traincrew.conrail1285.com. And it's a really, really neat application that you can use. And let me see if I can bring it up here. And what I do is I'll bring it up on my phone or my computer. And let's see here, when this thing comes up, it loads here. All right, we're gonna show you here. I'm gonna stop sharing the address here. All right, so let's see here if we can see this here. But do more than run your trains with Train Crew. So what you can do is there's a section here on handbrake ops, and if you can see that, there's set the handbrake and release the handbrake. So when you hit the button here, I don't know if you can hear that, but you hear the ratcheting sound of someone setting a handbrake. and it takes a few seconds. So if you go through and you need to set the brake on several cars, you have to play the sound effect for each car that you want to set it on. And so if you do this during an operating session, it's pretty neat. It helps slow you down. And he's got several other applications in here. The other one that you can, this is the one that I use a lot, is releasing the handbrake. So what you do is, as you're going through and you're doing your operating session, use that app, you hold it. If one person's the conductor and the other one's the engineer, the conductor can just punch this up as he's setting and releasing the handbrake. Now, if you don't want to use the app, that's fine, but then you just maybe just simulate or say, okay, I'm setting the handbrakes or I'm releasing the handbrakes. One of the other things that I've done to kind of slow things down a little bit is I've used a speed curve, and I think I mentioned it in one of the other broadcasts, but my locomotives are set with a maximum speed of about 13 to 15 miles an hour. So it doesn't matter how fast or how much you turn the throttle, the maximum speed that you're going to get out of that locomotive is, say, 13 to 15 miles an hour. So slowing it down, operating a little bit slower, also using the proto throttle, that's another great way to slow things down, because it takes a little while as you're switching. You can't just flip the switch back and forth and operate really quickly. If you don't have the proto throttle, you can use the braking feature, which comes on the decoders. You just have a button as you set your CVs pretty high for acceleration and deceleration, and then use the braking function to actually stop the locomotive. And that adds, again, more fun. You have to think a little bit ahead. It's not just simply turning the knob and the locomotive stops. You have to turn the knob down and then it keeps coasting, and then you apply the brake and it'll slowly come in. Alex, you had mentioned, we had talked earlier about grade crossing procedures. That's not something that people think about a lot. Pretty much you think about a grade crossing, it's blow the horn, the train goes through, and that's pretty much it. But how does a grade crossing get into your operations?
So there's a couple things you can do that I've found, that I've seen prototype examples that I do incorporate or I don't incorporate. One that's really interesting is the town I live in, Aberdeen, North Carolina. There's a spot downtown where the Aberdeen, Carolina Western Railroad, it's a big short line, robust short line, meets the CSX, and the railroad curves through downtown Aberdeen, and it curves through really sharp. And so there's a spot where it crosses through an intersection in a street, and it sharply curves through buildings. So you don't see the train unless it's in the middle of the street. You would never see it. So they actually have a requirement that a crew member has to flag that crossing. Now the way their railroad works, their conductor follows the train in a pickup truck, so the train doesn't have to stop for that crew member. But if they have the conductor riding on board the train, then that would be something you have to stop or slow down for the conductor to get off, flag the crossing, and then get back on the train. So you can have crossings that need to be flagged. I saw them the other day switching where there's a crossing they don't normally flag, but they were backing across it because they had just done a switching move. And so the conductor was riding the shove. He got down, flagged the crossing, got mad at a few cars who wouldn't stop for him and went around him. I believe what he said on the scanner was, "I hate people."
Nice.
And then they kept going. You can have issues with traffic. And then there are rules about how long you can block a crossing. That is one that I've incorporated on my layout, where I don't just leave a string of cars sitting across the street. And also, so one thing when I was designing my East Penn switching layout, it's a really, really, really small layout, and I actually wanted to be able to use all the sound features. So I specifically put a grade crossing across my switching lead, so that I would have to utilize the horn and the bell when I'm pulling cars from the industry or I'm switching stuff out. And it just, to me, it adds the dynamic of, instead of just the engine accelerating back and forth and stopping, you actually had to get to use the bell and the horn a little more. Not blocking the street, flagging a crossing, if the conductor's riding the shove. All those things can kind of add that interesting dynamic. And also, if there's something like having to flag a crossing, maybe that's something you don't want to have to do too many times if you can avoid it. So setting up your switching moves, thinking ahead, so that you're getting the most bang for your buck, just like the real railroad would.
Yeah. Well, on certain railroads, they're not allowed to block a crossing for say more than 10 minutes.
Mhm.
So the crew, that's part of their switching operation. They may have to split the train while they're doing the switching. They may have 10 cars or something, but they're going to be blocking the crossing, so they need to set the cars off. Typically, most rules are going to be somewhere between 50 and 100 feet away, so the cars need to be. Typically, most of them are going to say 100. On my railroad, what I did was I said 50 feet, just again because everything's compressed. So one car length. You can't have a car sitting closer than one car length to the crossing. And on a couple of my grade crossings, I have sensors, just like the real railroad does. If you go into a certain block, it's going to activate the sensor and the gates are going to come down, the lights are going to start flashing. So as the crew is switching, in my case, like Dow Chemical, they need to split the crossing, but not only split the crossing, but they need to stay clear of where those sensors are that activate the crossing. If they don't, then the lights are flashing, the gates are staying down the whole time, which is then what happens is typically, just like in the real world, cars will start going around and it just creates all kinds of problems. So I request the crews make sure that the gates stay in the up position, make sure they're clear. I'll show them where the photo sensors are so that they don't block the crossing and trigger the sensors for that. So that's something else that you can do that adds time to your operation rather than just going in, switching the cars and stop. Now you've got to split the train, then you got to put the train back together. You have to get the car. So all these things add time. And what we're looking to do is to make a small layout operate a little bit larger, operate like a larger layout. And by doing some of these prototype things, it slows it down. It's more realistic, and it gives you a little bit longer operating session than just quickly switching. I'm going to show you here in just a second here. I'm going to do a little demonstration. So I'm going to move my camera over here. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to show you, we'll say, a typical operating speed that most people will start off with when they start operating trains. Not going to follow any prototype procedures. Locomotive's just going to come in, pick up the car, and take it, and see how long that takes. And then the next time, what I'll do is then I'll spot the car. I'll set the car out, cut the engine loose, take them back to the engine service facility, see how long that takes. Then we'll do a more prototypical operation, following some of the rules of doing a 3-step and safety stops and all that other stuff. One other safety stop I forgot to mention is when you're shoving a train into a dead-end siding that has a bumping block or a bumper at the end. A lot of the railroads require a safety stop 2 car lengths before the end of the track. The reason behind that is to control the movement. So if you stop 2 car lengths before, now the rest of that movement is done much slower and they're able to spot the car rather than, whoops, we shoved it too far and it went through the bumping block and down the hill and into the creek. So we definitely don't want to do that. And you could do that on a model railroad just like you can do it on a prototype railroad. Again, lots of great stories about cars being shoved or dropped or whatever, and all of a sudden they go off the end of the track, and people got a lot of explaining to do, and again, more paperwork than most people really want to deal with. So they'll do a safety stop, in that case 2 car lengths prior to the end of the movement. They'll stop. The conductor will get out. Sometimes he'll go to the end, make sure everything's good. Then they'll make the final shove move into position. And on some jobs, it's really important to get that car spotted exactly where it needs to be. A few feet one direction or the other, the loading chute may not line up, the dock plates may not line up with the boxcar doors. So sometimes it's a real art form to get that car spotted perfectly where it needs to be, and that needs to be done under a very controlled movement, which typically is very slow.
I was watching a local crew do some switching the other day, taking some photos from a safe distance, and listening to the scanner, and they were griping about how the plant manager had been very specific. He wanted these cars here and these cars here, and they were kind of frustrated by how demanding it was. But I mean, it was part of the job. Is what they had to do. While you're set, speaking of tests, I have a good friend. Another test he comedically refers to is the annual derail test, as he put it. There's a place in Waco, Texas, a Mars candy plant. They have their own switcher inside the plant. He's like, about once a year they decide to test the derail. Right? What do you mean? Just go over the derail and derail something. And he's like, yep, derail still works.
Tom, I have a question from
Sure.
from the professor. He wants to know, he says, explain safety stop in context of RCP/RCL and RCO operations.
I'm not sure what those RCP and RCO abbreviations are. Maybe
Yeah, like
somebody
remote control operations.
maybe yeah, remote pack where they're operating with a pack where you've got one person, one crew, basically a one-person crew. So he's the engineer, he's the conductor and stuff. I would say the same rules apply. They need to make sure that those movements are under a controlled situation. So you can't go just zipping in and slamming the coupling. All right. Well, here's the first one. What I'm going to do is I'm going to hopefully time this one here and see how long it takes to do this. So what we're going to do is I've got a caboose over here that I'm going to pick up. I've got my engine located over here in the engine house, and he's going to start off. And as I start him off, I'm going to go ahead and start my watch. And we're just going to come in, and this is typically how most people will do the switching. So you're going to come in here. And again, I'm using a handheld throttle here. All right, there's my coupling. Line my switch, and we're going to go ahead and pull off here.
It's
All right,
a little
that's
fast for yard limits there, Tom.
Yeah, a little bit. You think? So what is typical speed in the yard?
10 miles per hour.
10 miles. Well, as safe as it can be safely done. In some places, 10 miles an hour is too fast.
Mm-hmm.
And my good friend Tom Holly, who's a retired NS engineer, has mentioned that many times. Yes, that's the maximum speed, but many times you can't see around a curve or you can't see far enough. You need to be able to stop within the distance that you see, within half the distance. So sometimes 10 miles an hour is way too fast. So that took about 30 seconds. So that was just a simple come in, pick up the car, and take it out. So now what we're going to do, I'm going to reset here. And we're going to do basically the same thing, coming back. I'm going to try to start the clock at about the same time. So we're going to come in. Bring the car into position. Again, maybe a little bit fast. Stop. Make my cut. Pull forward. Going to throw the switch as the engine's already moving because we got a conductor that can fly. And now we're back in the tracks. And again, that took about 30 seconds, roughly. So now let's see if I can fire this thing up. I'm gonna switch over and take another locomotive. And what I'm gonna do, for those of you that haven't seen this before, this is the proto throttle, so I need to go in and select my locomotive. All right, so here I've loaded the locomotive in. The next thing I'm going to do is I'm going to start the locomotive. And again, it's probably going to be a little bit hard to hear the locomotive here with my microphone set up here. So now what we're going to do, we've got the controls. So here's my throttle, my reverser, which centered is neutral, and then the brake. Then I also have individual controls for the headlights. If you notice on the other locomotive, the headlights were automatic depending on direction. So prior to moving the locomotive, what I can do is put both lights on dim. Since we're working inside yard limits, we don't want, and inside the engine facility, we don't want to blind anybody. You don't really want to use ditch lights when you're working a yard or in the locomotive service facility. So now we've got our locomotive ready to go. Start the bell ringing, which if I get a little closer here, you can hear it. Go into reverse, and let me reset my clock here. Okay, so now we're going to go ahead and Notch it up here, a couple of notches. If you can, again, if you can see that, it's a little hard for me to hold this where you can see and everything, but you got the idea. So we're coming in under a controlled movement. I'm going to start throttling back here, notching back down as I'm getting close. And as I get towards about 2 car lengths, 1 car length, go into idle, and you notice the locomotive still keeps rolling. And then I'm going to go ahead and apply the brake. And the locomotive stops. That's about 1 car length. In this case, we can go ahead and shut off the bell. So now what we're going to do is we're going to simulate going and doing a car inspection. So the conductor is going to dismount. He's going to walk around the car, make sure everything looks good. Everything's in the right place, and make sure that the coupler is lined up properly. That's another thing. If the car fails to couple and you need to pull forward to adjust the coupler, there needs to be about 50 feet or 1 car length. So if you go in, couple up, it fails to couple, the engineer is supposed to pull forward about 50 feet, stop, allow the conductor to go in, make the adjustment on the knuckle. So now we've done our car inspection. So I can release the brake, and we're going to ease back into the coupling. So everything looks good. The conductor would say we're half a car. He's going to count down the car lengths to a coupling, 20 feet, 10 feet, 5, and that'll do. And there's our coupling. We're going to center and set. Brake is set. It's centered. Conductors now has to go between the cars to connect up. One of the other things that he could do also, if you want to, is do a where you pull forward just a little bit to make sure you've got a good joint, to make sure that you do have a good coupling. So you would ask for them to just pull ahead slightly. We would check to make sure we've got a good coupling. You don't necessarily have to do that, but you could say that. Then the other thing would be come over and get my app here. Again, I'm trying to do multiple hands here, so
I believe in you, Tom. You can do this.
yeah. So now come over here and hit my button for release the handbrake. And let's see if the sound effect will go here. Anyway, we would release the handbrake. We're good. So now what we're going to do, we're going to pull forward. In this case, the conductor would need to walk over and line the switch. So he'd have to walk up here, line the switch over, and then call for the locomotive to come ahead. So we're going to release the brake. It's in forward. We're going to start notching up. And we've got a good coupling. We're moving forward. I don't know if you guys can see that or not, but then we're going to go ahead and start notching back down once we get the initial momentum going. Come in, and then we'll go ahead and stop right there.
Beautiful.
Now, that took about 3 minutes, plus I had to talk a little bit. So let's take a little bit of time out. So typically, that first procedure took about 30 seconds. By following a few of the prototype procedures, it took about 2 minutes. So if you figure if you got to do that for each car or each time that you make a connection, it's going to add to the operating session. All right, let's see here. Let me just.
And I think that goes into a lot of the theme of this series, and I'm sure you and John would agree with me that with a small layout, you can really focus on quality over quantity and everything there. So you have quality of your rolling stock, some great weathering Tom's got there, quality of scenery, quality of modeling, and then the kind of operating we're talking about, it is just playing into that quality of operating session. That you're getting a lot more bang for your buck in a small place just by focusing on doing things a little bit more detailed.
Yep. One of the other things that I have with the proto throttle with these 2 buttons here, the first one I have set up, which again, it's going to be hard for you guys to hear this, but when I play this top button, that gives me the coupler clank. And when I hit it again, it gives me the air discharge, like the air hoses are being disconnected. So as I couple up, sometimes I'll hit this button trying to coordinate that. If you see some of my videos, that's where that sound effect comes from, is from hitting this button. And you can kind of hear it. And then you play the sound effect again, and that's the air hoses separating as the car moves apart, as the locomotive moves ahead. So now what we're going to do is we've reset everything. Now we're going to come back and drop this, set this car out. So we've got everything set. I've gone into reverse. I'm going to start notching up. And again, if there was people walking around, I could start the bell ringing just to be safe. So now we're getting up here. We're a couple of car lengths away from the end of the siding. So the conductor would say, give me a slow stop, slow. Now the conductor would get off. He'd walk the track, make sure everything looks good. We're good. Everything looks right. Come on back. We've got 2 cars to a stop, and we're clear for 2. And it would go something like, conductor to GNR 9706, 2 cars to a stop, come on back. And then the 9706 would respond back, 2 cars to a stop, backing up. So now he's going to back up. We give him a car countdown. We'd say 1 more car, half a car, 20 feet, 10 feet, 5, and that'll do GNR 9706. We've got everything set, centered and set. So we've centered the reverser. We've set our brake. Now the conductor would go in and he would set his hand brakes. So I could come in here and hopefully play the sound effect for setting the hand brakes. So we've got that. We've set the brakes. The conductor would need to request red zone. So it would be centered, conductor to GNR 9706, requesting red zone. Centered and set, 9706, clear to step in. Conductor would answer back, stepping in. He'd go in, he'd shut the angle cock off for the air hose. And then this would be the time that you could come in here and make your cut. You come in, make your cut on the car. They would also say at this time they would do the securement test, so they would make sure that the car's not rolling. In our next segment, we're going to show you some options for wheel chocks and some other things. I've got little wheel chocks that I can put in if there is a little bit of a grade on a siding. I can do that. So now we've done our securement test. We can go ahead and pull forward, but again, now the conductor's got to walk up here and line the switch again because they want to go back to the engine house. So he give them time to walk up here. Now they would say, conductor to GNR 9706, pull ahead. So he'd pull up. Now, Alex mentioned something. Some railroads allow the conductors to board and dismount from moving equipment. Some railroads do not. So in this case, if the conductor was down here, we'd stop, allow him to get up on board, and now he can ride it down to the engine house rather than having to walk all that way. And it's a lot easier to walk. It's a lot easier to ride than it is to walk. So now, and another great saying is, when you get tired of walking, you'll start thinking. That's the way that it works for a conductor. If you get tired of walking, you want to start thinking about how you're going to do these operations. So now we've gone back to the engine house, and again, that took about 4 minutes or so to be able to do this. Again, I'm stopping and talking on this, but so once we've arrived, I'll shut my lights off. That's something else that with the proto throttle, once you're getting ready to go out onto the main line, you can switch this over from headlights from dim to bright, and then bright with ditch lights. So now we've got the ditch lights on. And again, that's something that the prototype crews do. So you need to switch as you're moving and switching ends of the locomotive. Sometimes you want your bright on the rear headlight. Sometimes you want your bright on the front headlights, depending on which way you're going. So basically, that's about it for the prototype operations. And again, you can see how that adds a little more time to your operating session.
Absolutely.
You got anything you want to add there, Alex?
No, I think that, I think the more you can slow things down, the better. You can, and even it's just sometimes things I'll realize, oh, I really enjoy this scene. I'm not just blowing through it at 50 scale miles an hour, but I'm enjoying the modeling that I put work into. What do you think, John?
Yeah, I mean, again, like I said earlier, as a kind of a newcomer to prototype modeling, um, it's a bit intimidating at first. Not knowing a lot about the prototype, the real railroad and the rules to follow. So, in the beginning, it's easy to kind of fall into the trap of just moving cars around, which is fun, but like you said, with the railroad, with our layouts being so small. Um, by slowing things down, using the features like momentum and braking, even without a proto throttle. I mean, I would love to have one day, hopefully soon. I don't use one, so but I'm still able to kind of slow down my operation, and I use the NCE Power Cab. But it's there's days where I'll come in here and I'll just move cars around, you know, kind of semi-realistic, and maybe not even use sound just for fun. But I think Tom and I were talking the other day, and we were saying, how, for some people it is intimidating, and you don't have to get as in depth as we're going, but give your railroad a purpose, and it kind of adds a lot of fun, in my opinion.
Yeah, there's a lot of videos out on YouTube if you just kind of punch around and look for prototype videos. And there's the ones I like are the ones that have the radio communication in there. So you hear the crews talking back and forth. And that kind of gives you an idea now that we've hopefully shown some things to you, maybe that you knew or maybe you didn't know. And the only way you find out is by watching. And in our case, way I found out was I was working for a scenic railroad. So I got firsthand information because I was doing that. I was counting down cars. I was doing the communication between the conductor, in this case, I was a trainman, and the engineer, and doing those. That communication is what I really enjoy about model railroading. So that's why I like to operate with two-person crews, because I like that communication and where you're switching and talking and trying to work things out. And one of the interesting things was when I would do switching moves with the engineer on the scenic railroad. Of course, he was very senior and I was very junior, and I would figure out how I wanted to do the moves, and he would go, "Are you sure you want to do it that way, Tom?" Which meant you probably don't. You're probably doing too many steps or something like that. So it was a nice way of him saying, maybe there's a better way, and to think about it, which was great, because again, that's the way you learn. You got to start moving these chess pieces in your head, basically. You need to move 2 or 3, 4, 5 moves ahead, and what you're doing now at this one spot will pay off when you get to the end, and you've got your cars in order, or you've sorted things out properly. Again, a lot of people don't think about that, but on the real railroad, they'll spend a lot of time in the yard lining up their cars so that they're in the proper order, so that when they get to the industry, they don't have to do that much work. It's already done for them, and they can do it in the yard where there's light and it's easier walking and stuff, versus some of these sidings. You've got, steep ballast, you've got briars, you got all kinds of stuff, tight clearances. You don't really want to be doing switching in some of these locations where any more than you have to. So work in the yard, or work where it's good or easy level switching, and do that. And the same thing, you can do the same thing on your model railroad. If you have a yard, do some switching, get your cars lined up in order. And they may not be in the same order that you think, because some could be facing, some could be trailing. So you want to work trailing point industries first. There's a lot of things to think about when you're setting up your car. Let me jump over here real quick. What I'd like to do is, Alex has got his little East Penn Railroad. I want him to talk about that for just a couple of minutes, and kind of how he uses that. First of all, what we'll do is I'll show the picture where it shows, because we had talked about this last time, shows the layout in his living room and how nicely he's finished it off, and you can see that. So if you want to just give us a little information about that layout there, Alex.
Yeah, so this is, I've called it several things. I just call it East Penn because it's supposed to be a fictional branch line of the East Penn Short Line Railroad in eastern Pennsylvania. It's kind of inspired by Lance Meinheim's blog on the one turnout approach. Basically, there's multiple car spots at one industry, which we talked about in our design episode last week. The idea of making an industry that takes different cars and takes those cars at specific spots. And so it's a big industrial, like food processing plant that takes a hopper car with grain. It takes 3 different types of corn syrup, and you have to put the corn syrup cars by the unloading hoses, which I shamelessly copied John's corn syrup unloading hoses. I literally was like, I watched the videos, like, okay, I need that from Hobby Lobby, and went over and bought it. And then you see the locomotive switching there, and I have one yard track to kind of help sort things out, because it can get really dicey to switch all of that. And also the flip side is I don't have a huge long lead to make long switching moves, because it's not a big layout. It just sits there in the living room on top of the bookshelves. I have gotten up to a 30-35 minute operating session with those two switches in that one industry.
Right,
Just
and
by
it's spot specific too, which
Yeah.
which also creates more time because you've got to sort the cars into proper
Mhm.
order. And if you've got a car that needs to be picked up and a respot, then you've got to move the respot and
Exactly.
sort that in, and all that can add time to an operating session.
It gets really long. It's like I said, it's designed to be a little bit of a puzzle, and not a puzzle like with a ton of crazy tracks. But you've got to have that. Let's say I've got to pull that hopper car way back there, that last spot, and I got to move all those other cars out of the way. And doing things like just running it slower, making sure that the crossing is clear. I'm using a NCE power cab, just like John has on his layout here. Nothing fancy, but it provides a lot of enjoyment. It's there in the living room, and I've got a drink holder on it, so I can just sit there and switch cars and watch TV with the wife. Sometimes I turn off the sound decoder. And the flip side is sometimes I got this idea from Tom Johnson and his Logansport and Indiana Northern Model Railroad. Is I can simulate the crew taking time to do things just by walking away for a minute. So if I say, hey, they're doing the brake test, or they're walking the cars, or whatever, I'll just put the throttle back in the little throttle pocket, and if I need to refill in a cup of coffee or grab another drink out of the fridge, I'll go do that. I'll come back like, all right, that ought to be the brake test, and then I get back to work. So you can build. It doesn't have to be anything formal, and I don't use any paperwork. It's all just kind of in my head. What I always do, and I think this helps with staying motivated to operate on both layouts. I always set up my operating session as soon as I'm finished, switching some cars around. I'll set up the train for the next operating session. I'll throw a couple more cars behind the locomotive for the next inbound train. So it's just, I'm going to grab this, and I'll look at, okay, I threw a box car and a tank car here, which I'm going to pull one of these tank cars and swoop them out, and then I'm going to drop this box car. Or maybe I have two, cars of the same type, so it's going to be an off spot where it's sitting on another track waiting to be loaded into the plant. And so there's informality, but I know how I think, and I know that I'm going to remember what those cars were for. And so I just make sure I set that up ahead of time. So if it's been like, I've got 10 minutes before we leave for church on a Sunday morning, I'm going to grab the throttle and run some trains for a minute. And I have it all set up so I can do that.
Yeah. That's one of the great benefits of having a small layout, because a couple of days ago I came down and just switched some cars. I didn't have a switch list. I'm going to pick these up, I'm going to set these out, and just did an informal. And then, like you said, then after I did that, then I restaged the layout so it would be ready to go based on a switch list if somebody were to come over, or if I wanted to operate a more formal operating session. While we're talking about that, what I want to do is show a couple of examples of switch lists and car movement control, or however you want to talk about it. That can be car cards and waybills. It can be switch lists. It can be a bunch of different things. For a small layout, typically, though, we're gonna focus more on switch lists. Car cards and waybills work. They've been around for a long time. A lot of guys love them. A lot of guys hate them. It's up to you. If you like them, use them. I personally don't really care for car cards and waybills, but again, that's just my opinion. If you give me a stack of car cards, I'll write up a little switch list, so I have one piece of paper that I can look at rather than having to shuffle the deck and somebody drops cards. And I've worked on some layouts where somebody's lost the card and now we can't find where that one goes, and it can just create all kinds of problems. So one of the things that you can do is just make up a real simple switch list. Let's see here. Let's see if I can find it here. I need to go back here and open up this one here. So, and for a basic switch list, you really don't need much. Just let's see if I can find this now here. Maybe on a different tab. Let's see here. Let's try that. Let's see if we can show that. All right. Are we sharing that there?
Yep.
I don't know. Okay, you can see the work order or switch list. Basically, you have the train, and this is just on an Excel spreadsheet, or you could do it in Word. You have an industry. You could write in the industry, car number, the type, and basically all the conductor really needs to know is what's the car, what car number is it, where is it going, and is it a hazardous materials car, which is something that we didn't really talk about that much. But if you have a hazardous materials car, typically that needs to be spaced away from the engine 3 to 5 cars, depending on the railroad. For my railroad, I have I say one car length is sufficient. So again, that's one of them.
Well, and Tom, I'll
Let's see
interject
here.
on that. I'll
Let's
say,
stop that one.
if I can, it helps to know the prototype there too. So
Sure.
I think what we talked about, what we have been talking about is modern era. I think all three of us model modern era.
Yep.
But I was researching a branch of the Katy, the MKT Railroad in West Oklahoma in the early 70s, and they hauled natural gas out of some natural gas fields. And the crew was actually quoted as saying, I don't care about the rules. I want that natural gas car right behind the locomotive where I can keep an eye on it. So their derailments were really frequent on this line. And if they had a truck off the rails, they wanted to know about it by being able to see it, which is kind of goes against conventional wisdom, but that was how they did things in the Katy Northwest. So, and that's generally, yes, you always
Right.
have those hazmat cars back, but just once again, getting intimate and knowing what you're modeling, and even if you're freelancing, what sort of era and practices you're modeling can really change what you're doing depending on the railroad.
Right. Well, here's another option, which is on my old layout, I had what I called a job aid, which was a standard 8.5 by 11 paper. And what I did was I put instructions on one side and it would fold this over in half, and I had a plastic sleeve that it would go in. So on one side were the instructions, which would tell you what your job was going to be. Because if you came to the railroad, you may not know how I operated my railroad. So this pretty much would walk you through. You're going to pick up your locomotive. You're going to go to the yard track number 5. You're going to get a clearance form, and it would walk you through. And then on the other side, it's got the industries, each industry. And then I've been told red and green is not really the best colors to use because a lot of people are red-green colorblind. But if you could offset the colors so that you know which ones are pickups and which ones are, in this case, place. And there's a little key down at the bottom. PL is place, PU is for pull. So it's up to you. You could use some have spot and pull and set, and again, it all depends on the railroad as to what they're doing. In this case, I would have 2 cars at Interstate Fuel. So I'm going to pick up 2 cars and I'm going to place 2 cars, and the same thing. And then it would at the scrap metal dealership. So it would say. So you would see which ones you wanted to pick up, and again, there wasn't that way there. You knew all the colors. If it was all red, that was what was in your train. If it was all green, then that was what was being picked up, or whatever. So you could set up whatever color codes you wanted. On my layout, I got a little bit more prototypical, and I copied a basic prototype switch list, and I set it up on an Excel spreadsheet. Let's see if I can do this here. And again, these are on my website. If you want to go on, you can go to thomasklamowski.com and you can see my switch lists and everything else. Here is it's kind of a combination. This is the top part of it would be what they consider a yard report, which is the cars that are listed in the yard. And then as you come down the list, the first industry from south to north is Georgia Metal Coaters, and then Universal Alloy, and so on down the line. And what you do is you look here on the first line, it shows the car number, it shows whether it's empty or loaded. And then if it says block to CSX Elizabeth, that means that's going to be a pull. You're going to pull that car. Then you look up in your train and you see how many cars you got going to Georgia Metal Coaters. In this case, you got 3 cars going to Georgia Metal Coaters. So now you know which ones you're going to set out as you go down. each of the industries. If there's no cars at the industry, then there's nothing listed. If down here at the bottom, I don't know if you can see that or not, Argos, you notice that there's 2 cars that it says blocked to Argos. Well, those cars are still being unloaded at Argos, so they're not going anywhere because it's has the industry name there. That means they're going to stay at that industry. So it's a pretty simple switch list. Once the crews kind of get used to it, it's not too hard to get them familiar with it. There's plenty of other options for switch lists. We're not going to really talk about that tonight, but there's JMRI. There's also Switch List, which is a new program I wasn't aware of, which is for Mac and for Mac/Apple. It's a free app that you can go down and you just go to Switch List and download the app, and that will that'll give you a start. It's similar to JMRI. I've started going into JMRI for switch lists. I've done some of the work to get it set up, but the problem is some of it is a little complicated for what I want to do. Trying to get cars to move based on the Georgia Northeastern, and again, it's a little bit. Oops, wrong one. Let me see here if I can find the right one. But JMRI, what if you can get it working? It's really good. Our club uses it, and we've had good success with it, and it works really well, especially for a large layout. Maybe it's a little bit overkill, we'll say, for a small layout. Let's see here. Again, gotta go to screen. Yeah, there it is. Okay. This is what a JMRI switch list looks like, and it just comes right as it comes out. If you don't modify it, there's another program that you can load it into where it kind of cleans it up a little bit. But this shows you the cars that you're picking up in the yard, the work in Marietta, which just lists all the industries. They're not broken down by individual industries unless you go a little bit further into the program than I have. And then once you get back to Elizabeth Yard, it shows where you're going to set those cars out. And again, it's a good program, but it may be a little bit more complicated than what some people want to do. And let me show one more here, which we're going to go here. This is a way that you can kind of, we'll say, translate it into something that looks a little bit easier to read. And let's see here. Let's see which one it is. Let's see if it's that one. Maybe it's that one. Nope, that's the same one. I got too many things open here. I got to find the right one. But basically what it does is it translates this into something that it looks a little bit easier to follow. All right, there we go. Hopefully that's a little better. There you go. And see, this is a program that will translate that information that comes out of JMRI and puts it into a little bit more easy to read manifest. And you can set this up and change the categories and do a lot of stuff. Again, it's still a little bit scheduled work for Marietta. The industries are still kind of scattered around here a little bit. It's a little bit harder to read. But again, it's all in what you want to get, what you want to do, what you want to get used to. So let's talk a little bit. We're getting a little bit short on time, but let's talk a little bit about two-person crews. What we like to do, again, it's up to the operator pretty much. If you want to run a two-person crew, great. If you want to run one person, the problem is on a switching layout is it starts to get to be a little bit too much overload, if you will, for one person to try to plan out the switch moves, operate the locomotive, carry the paperwork, figure all this stuff out. For an informal operating session, you can just operate the train. That's fun. But if you really want to do a we'll say more prototypical operating session, it's much better with two people. It allows each person to concentrate on their job. That way the conductor's kind of planning out the moves. And then he's just talking to the engineer, walking them through the different jobs. It really adds enjoyment to an operating session. One of the things that's important though, when you're giving commands, you need to know which way is forward and which way is reverse. And you would think that'd be pretty easy, but it's not. On a locomotive, you're going to find one end of the locomotive has an F on the front, which indicates that's the front. On the Georgia Northeastern, a GP9, actually, their locomotive runs long hood forward. So forward is kind of backwards from what you would think, because normally you think the short hood would be going forward, but the way the locomotive is set up, the long hood is forward. So when you're giving commands from the conductor to the engineer, you tell the locomotive to pull forward. Well, that may actually be reverse for the engineer. So it can kind of get, we'll say, backwards, or you'll get confused. And depending on the railroad, you may do different things. I know that based on some prototype experience, a yard may be set up so that whenever you're going west, that's forward. And whenever you're going east, that's reverse. Doesn't matter which way the locomotive is going. And the crew knows that because they've had a job briefing. So they're going to talk about that prior to going on duty. And they're going to say, for this job, every time I tell you to go forward, that means you're going to go west. It doesn't matter if you're running long hood forward, short hood forward, forward or reverse. So it can get a little confusing. One of the other things that a pet peeve of my engineer friend, he hates it when the conductor says, go ahead and back up. That's a conflicting command. Do you want me to go ahead or you want me to back up? You can't do both. So try not to use those terms. If you want to say back towards me, so many cars, or shove towards me. And that's another thing is if some crews, and again, the engineer that I work with on the Georgia Northeastern, he says, I should always know where the trainman or the conductor is. So if you give commands, shove them towards me, take them towards you, I know where you are. I know which way that means. So that way you don't have to say forward and reverse. So you can work that out as a crew briefing, and that's something that you should discuss. Some railroads, if the engineer, if it's forward, it's the direction that forward is for the engineer. So you have to give that command, even though it may be backing up. You're going to say pull forward, and it's a reverse move. So he's going to say reverse, or take them to you. And again, you would think that would be pretty easy, but it can get confusing very quickly. Some of the other things that we're going to talk about real quick as we're starting to wrap up.
Well, I have a couple of questions.
Yes, go ahead, Bill.
Robert Holloman wants to know, how do Alex and John do ops on their layouts?
After you, John.
Okay. If my internet drops out, I apologize. It's kind of hit or miss right now for me. But for my layout, I do depending on the mood I'm in. But mostly I have a basic switch list, very similar to Tom. He actually helped create mine. But mine's very kind of informal, or I come in here, I'll usually set up a few cars on the interchange track. I have about 7 or 8 preset switch lists that I have that kind of just rotate through. An op session for me could take anywhere from, 20 to 45 minutes, depending on how many cars I'm moving around. Again, I don't use the proto throttle, so I still try to replicate as many prototypical moves as I can. But yeah, I tend just to come in here and have some fun. The best is Tom is really the only other model railroader that's been here to operate on my layout. Everybody else is kind of like my nephew will come over, and he's not really into model railroading, but he really enjoys. I'll tell him, I'll give him a switch list, and I'll just highlight the cars, where they need to go, and he'll take the throttle, and he kind of just moves them around, and it's like a game of chess for him or something like that. So that's me. I'm learning a lot. Obviously this has been great for me to learn a lot of the prototypical side of things. So again, this was just my first layout that I really built. So the next layout, I've got so many more ideas of adding in more prototypical parts of the railroad to it. But yeah, I'm pretty informal, but I try to make it as realistic as I can.
I'm probably pretty similar to John. I'm a solo operator. I've had no other. I'd love to have people over. Just haven't had the chance to. My wife does operate with me sometimes. She'll be the engineer and I'll be the conductor. She's great at it, but she does like to ring the bell or blow the horn at unprototypical places just because she knows it annoys me. But what I do is, you can see over there by the end of the layout, I just stage a train, and I always that's my rule. I never operate the layout without restaging it. Today being the exception, I wanted to, in case somebody asked, have cars at every industry so you can see them. But I start the train over there. I come in, I work the industries. I try to use as many prototypical practices as possible. The one this layout is still under construction, and so I don't have a walk around throttle. I actually have my Digitrax Zephyr console there behind me, and so sometimes I'll have to make an prototypical stop just so I can get over and uncouple a car and go back to the console. But so one thing that I do have that kind of adds some operational interest, if you see there is a dummy track for a railroad that crosses mine at grade. And so it's right on the switching lead for just about every industry you work here in my HO scale version of Frederick, Oklahoma. And so you have to come to a stop. The engineer has to come to a stop at that grade crossing, blow the horn before moving across that grade crossing. So that just adds a level of complexity to how I operate things. But there's streets to cross. I do things like safety stops. I do things like, in my head, like, all right, we're knocking off the handbrakes, or we're going to do a brake test. But a lot of mine is probably more like what John said. It's in my head and it's informal. And depending on how in depth I want to get with it, sometimes I've had a long day at work and I just want to see my trains run and move some cars around. And other days I'm like, all right, I'm going to take this, and like I said, it can be anywhere from 25 minutes to 45 minutes. Probably 40 minutes is a good operating session on my layout here. So do have plans to add some paperwork. I do have plans to add the proto throttle. It's definitely the side of model railroading I really like. And I'm really into operations. If anybody in Central North Carolina want to operate together, let me know. I would love to get together with people and operate. But it's still a building process, definitely for me as well.
Yeah.
Got any other questions there, Bill?
No, that was it.
We just got a couple more things that we're going to do. We're gonna wrap it up here pretty quick. But for hosting an operating session, if you haven't hosted one, some good ideas or some things that I've kind of incorporated into my operating session is, because I live up in the mountains of North Georgia, it's a little hard for people to come up here. So what I'll typically do is have them come up at noon, and I'll serve lunch. I'll make lunch. We'll have lunch. We get to know each other, kind of talk, and just because a lot of people I really don't know that well when they come and they request to operate on the layout. I've had people from all over the country come in and operate on the layout, which I'm shocked. But the farthest ones I had was a couple of people from Germany came and operated on the layout, which was awesome. They were really good. A couple of them spoke English, which was great. A couple of the other ones didn't speak German. I don't speak German, but we still had a good time. We all had it in common, which was model railroading. We all like trains and model railroading, so it worked out great. But a couple of things is, you want to establish some rules for your layout and for your operating session, whether you want to have beverages in there or not. Like I said, I typically have food before, and then that way people aren't hungry or looking at their watch. Well, I got to get going. Op sessions here are very informal. One of the things that I do now is I've got a sheet here, and you can see these on my website, but basically it shows the track diagram, because when people come over to your layout, you may know where XYZ grain company is, but I don't have a clue. So I'd like to know where it is if I've got to put cars there or pick up cars. So a little track diagram goes a long way with helping them out. In this case, I have them on the page so that they can quickly reference them. That way if I say drop it off on yard track 1, well, which one's 1? Well, where's the main line? Where's the arrival departure track? You can see it all right here on the track diagram. But the biggest thing is just to keep it fun, keep it relaxed. Nobody likes too many rules and getting too serious. The idea is to have fun, and I have the handout that I give out. And let's see if I can bring this up here real quick. And one of the rules on there is to just, what was that? Let me see here. Okay. Okay, here we go. So here's the rules, and these rules are established for safe and efficient operation. Common sense and good judgment be used in the absence of specific rules. That came right out of a prototype rule book. But the primary goal of the operating session is to have fun and enjoy operating on the layout. And then I give a little bit of instructions on speeds, crew instructions, how they operate, and that kind of stuff. Again, it just gives people a little bit of an idea of what I would like them to do when we're doing an operating session. It could be something as informal when I go to other operating sessions, they have a little crew briefing and they'll mention a few things about what to do, or if something's changed and there's a problem, maybe there's a problem with a turnout or something, just to let people know about those kinds of things. But that's basically about it. The whole idea of an operating session is that's when your layout comes to life. I mean, that's what you build this thing for, is to have an operating session and enjoy. In my case, I enjoy sharing it with people, to have them come over and do operating sessions. That's again the reason why I built it, and for myself to enjoy also. All right, Bill, you got anything else?
No, we lost you for a second there, Tom. But no, that's it. Basically, everybody's winding down on it. We want to thank you again for this time and for you guys putting this energy into this and this work, Tom. It has really been very informative and very educational. I'll tell you that much. Joe Lowe, is this the last segment? Well, I'm glad you asked that, Joe. No, this is not the last. We have one more that will air next week, October 17th. One more, October 17th at 9 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. And that show number 4 will be operational details and super detailing. Operational details add realism and time to an op session, while super detailing can enhance your model railroad. Those little things that you put on your layout that guys enjoy doing and buying and everything and making. So that will be the 4th installment of this. Will actually be the 5th point. Will be 4.1. Would you say, Tom?
Sure, we had to do 2 in 2 parts, so a 4-part series went to 5 parts, but
right.
It's okay. This will be our last one, unless somebody has a really great idea for another show.
We're working on it. But anyway, I want to thank you guys for taking the time out of your busy schedules, especially on a Saturday night when I know that you could be with your loved ones and hanging out with them. But we want to thank you for doing this. It has been truly, truly very informative, very educational, and for me, very inspiring. So I thank each and every one. And Tom, I thank you very much for your input and for coming up with this show. It's really been a great added addition to the Model Railroading live series here that we've been doing along that. And to you guys out there watching, keep watching, because if you're not watching, we're just talking to dead air. So you be safe out there, you be well, and you be blessed. Oh, and one more thing. Once again, we do apologize to Sir Rod Stewart. We were supposed to have you come in on this segment, but unfortunately, we ran out of time. And what can I tell you, Rod? I apologize. Please have your people call my people, and we'll work something out. Okay. In the meantime, you guys out there, take care, be well, be safe, be blessed, and we'll see you guys on the radio.